Okay, I think that most of the people who've signed in are here so far. Hopefully a couple more will join us as we go. But I will get going then with just kicking us off. And first off, just to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone who's joined us. I know we're all joining from all around the world. And thank you for joining our session today, which is titled the Adaptation Research Alliance, a new global initiative for action research. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Suzanne Carter, and I'm working at South North, an NGO based in South Africa. And I'm heading up the Adaptation Research Alliance's coordination unit. And I'll be your host today for the session. So we'll start shortly. So just while we're waiting for more people to join, I'll just explain the format and how you can interact with us during this session. So we'll run for at most 2 hours. We might be a little bit shorter than that. And we'll start off with a welcome address and introduction, followed by some high-level presentations that are pre-recorded. Then we'll move on to an interactive panel discussion titled Bridging Research and Action, the necessity for an ambitious Adaptation Research Alliance. And that'll include an opportunity for participants to pose questions to the panelists. And lastly, we will focus on the way forward in the final segment of the program. And in that, you'll also be given the opportunity to ask any questions about how this Adaptation Research Alliance is shaping up. So just a few very basic housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded, and this will be made available on both the ARA and Gobeshona websites in due course. All participants are on mute to avoid disruptions, so only the panelists, unfortunately, are able to speak. If you have any questions or points you'd like to make, you can add them through the Q&A box. You'll find that at the bottom tab of the Zoom screen. And so please do make use of that. And for any technical issues, you can send a direct message to South North in the chat box, or alternatively, if you're struggling with that, you can email us at ara@southnorth.org. All right, I have the honor then of welcoming, although I feel a bit strange welcoming you to your own conference, Professor, but we have Professor Salim Haq as our conference host for Gobeshona, providing the welcome. And he'll also give an introduction to what the Adaptation Research Alliance is. I'm sure most of you all know this already, but Salim is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and he's also one of the Adaptation Research Alliance's steering board members. So I'll hand over to you, Salim.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and good evening from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Thank you for ARA for organizing this session to soft launch the ARA. I'll just share a few thoughts wearing my several hats. So firstly, my hat as the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. I've been quite involved with my good friends Anand and Rosalind in the preparations and the designing of the ARA going forward. And I'm very pleased that ICAD is one of the founding partners, and I'm also part of the steering board. Secondly, my center runs a network of universities in the least developed countries, the LDC Universities Consortium on Climate Change. Incidentally, they'll be doing a session tomorrow. And they are very much also very keen to be part of the ARA, and they are also part of the founding membership of ARA. And my colleague, Professor Mizan Khan, coordinates that network of universities who are hopefully going to be significant partners going forward. And then my third hat is organizing this Gobeshona Conference. Gobeshona, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is a Bangla word for research. And it's very apt that the word Gobeshona is also in your title as the Adaptation Research Alliance. And it's something that we have set up 7 years ago, primarily based in Bangladesh, bringing together the research community here, universities, research institutions, and others. And amongst the many things that we used to do, we had a big annual conference every January where we had several hundred people come and spend 4 days at our university talking about things that they're doing. And this year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we went online. But by virtue of going online, we also went international and we went global on the theme of locally led adaptation, which is the specific area of interest that we have. And I'm very, very pleased to say how we got an enormous response from friends and partners around the world. And we ended up doing 7 days, 90 sessions over 7 days, 24 hours each day. And we're now coming to the end of the 6th day. And we have one more day to go tomorrow. And it's been tremendous. And we are very privileged and proud that our friends at the ARA have decided and wanted to use this opportunity to launch, soft launch the ARA during the Gobeshona Conference. And we look forward to continuing. We will continue. We've decided to continue this format of an online conference every year from now on. We're not going back to the old format. It's allowed us to link up with people all over the world. And the specific interest that we are exploring is linking up local adaptation that's taking place everywhere with other local adaptation that's taking place in other countries and indeed across continents. And we have actually been able to do that, and we hope to do even more going forward. So I hope every year we can have the ARA come back and tell us what's happening in terms of the further research that they're doing. We are pitching this as the first of a new series rather than the 7th of the old series. And we will come back each year up to the end of the decade to track progress, particularly on promoting locally led adaptation. I'll stop there for now. Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Salim, for that wonderful welcome to us. And we are very happy that we were able to partner with Gobeshona to do the soft launch of the ARA. I'm now going to kick off the high-level segment, as we would call it, if it was an in-person event, I suppose. And so on behalf of the UK government, we will now play a pre-recorded message from the Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth and the UK International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience for the COP presidency, which is Anne-Marie Trevelyan. So I'm just going to ask my colleagues if they can press go on that video. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so delighted to join you at the Gobeshona Global Conference on Locally Led Adaptation in support of the Adaptation Research Alliance. I would like to express my deep appreciation to the Government of Bangladesh for their leadership on climate adaptation. I'd also like to express my thanks to the International Centre for Climate Change and Development for conceiving and hosting this necessary and important conference. Locally led adaptation is so vitally important to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals for all our peoples and our planet. Communities are at the forefront of the climate emergency. They are the front line. So it stands to reason that the most effective solutions are tailored to the local context. That these solutions listen to the needs of those local communities and empowers young people, women, girls and others to create the solutions that they know will work. Effective solutions will harness national and international levels of change. Not only that, decades of learning and development cooperation have taught us that local leadership is essential to accelerating and sustaining development gains. The global climate emergency is therefore a local development opportunity. But we are at risk of missing this opportunity. Our current approach to adaptation has been fragmented and uncoordinated. Too often, those that research risks and vulnerabilities are disconnected from those that fund and implement actions in response to them, and from what communities want and need. And the scale of investment in adaptation just doesn't match the need, leading to our adaptation efforts often being suboptimal. That's why, as the UK's International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience for the COP26 presidency, I warmly welcome the joint commitment being made today to co-develop the Adaptation Research Alliance. The Adaptation Research Alliance aims to create the kind of systemic change that we need in the process of generating knowledge that is useful and practical on the ground. The United Kingdom has long been a proponent of this approach through its bilateral cooperation as well as its multilateral efforts. Together with Bangladesh, the UK and Egypt proudly led the Adaptation and Resilience workstream of the UN Secretary-General's Climate Action Summit in 2019. We believe the Adaptation Research Alliance has the potential to lead a transformation in how research is conducted and to link the knowledge and the action, a transformation on which the success of climate adaptation will depend. So I'm very encouraged by the ambition, the enthusiasm, and the diversity of the Adaptation Research Alliance partners. In just a few short months, through numerous virtual meetings, you have planted and grown a promising partnership. Over the course of this year, as you nurture and develop the Adaptation Research Alliance into a fully fledged initiative that seeks to strengthen the research action network through advocacy, cooperation, and walking the talk, I would like to make one request of you. Be bold. Partnerships are difficult by nature. It's going to take an extraordinary effort to realise the ambition you have set yourselves. The real litmus test of the Adaptation Research Alliance will be scaled up investment in action research. We are aiming for nothing short of systemic change. For this, we need all relevant stakeholders to join in this transformative effort. And I want to invite and encourage new partners to join the Adaptation Research Alliance. I am looking forward so much to seeing the growth of this partnership and to officially launching it at COP26. You have my utmost support. Thank you.
Well, that was a lovely speech from the Minister, and really sort of underlines how much of a key opportunity this is within the ARA to really do something different and to push something forward. And of course, the big opportunity at COP26 to galvanize action. I also have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Selwyn Hart, who's a special advisor to the UN Secretary General on climate action, also in a pre-recorded statement. And my colleagues could cue up his presentation, please. There we are.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to join you today in support of the Adaptation Research Alliance. As a special advisor to the UN Secretary General on climate action, I am often confronted by the questions: how do we increase action on adaptation and build resilience? And how do we ensure that it has the greatest impact? On one level, the answer is obvious. There is no doubt that we need more finance, policies, programs, and interventions, and that these are more effective when they are needs responsive, evidence-based, and data-driven. In short, action must be based on sound research. The rhetoric has become so ubiquitous among policymakers that it is easy to forget that reality lags behind. The fact is, there is a big gap between those on the front lines of climate action and the research community, which can help generate the most effective practical solutions. This gap is especially large for adaptation, which has traditionally been underserved in climate policy. And unfortunately, despite the rhetoric, it is not fashionable among policymakers or researchers to focus on this divide, even when the scale of the climate emergency demands the opposite. Now, there are many admirable efforts to bridge research and action, and gains have been made, but often in a very piecemeal way. There are still systemic challenges that continue to deny practitioners and policymakers the full potential of the global research community. We need a transformation, a paradigm shift, or, as the Secretary General has called for, a significant breakthrough. If 2020 has taught us anything about this topic, it's that when faced with a major global emergency, the research community can deliver. In less than a year since COVID-19 began, to spread across the globe. Vaccines have been developed and are being rolled out. A process that normally takes years was accelerated at an unprecedented rate by the research community. I take great inspiration from this success. The Secretary General has called for 2021 to be a year when the global community truly achieves a significant breakthrough on adaptation and resilience, and he has identified 5 priorities. First, donor countries and multilateral, regional, and national development banks need to significantly increase the volume and predictability of finance for adaptation and resilience. He's asked them to contribute at least 50% of their climate finance towards adaptation and resilience. Second, all budget allocations, investment decisions, procurement processes need to be climate resilient. Climate risk must be embedded in policies and actions at the national, state, and local levels, and developing countries must receive the necessary supporting tools to achieve this. Third, we need to significantly scale up existing catastrophe-triggered financial instruments, such as the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility and the African Risk Capacity, and develop new instruments to incentivize investments in resilience. For every dollar invested in climate resilient infrastructure, we save $6. Fourth, we need to ease access to finance, especially for the most vulnerable, and expand debt relief initiatives. Finally, we need to support regional and community-based adaptation and resilience initiatives. What you're trying to do with the ARA is directly linked to these priorities, in particular because climate adaptation must necessarily be tailored to the prevailing context and must be responsive to the specific needs of local communities. ARA can help to fill this gap. This is a big task, and I'm certain that we can rise to the challenge. The Adaptation Research Alliance is the start of the much needed systemic transformation, or breakthrough, as the Secretary General has called it, that we all need in order to re-engineer our research system in service of climate adaptation and resilience. I want to thank the government of the United Kingdom, and in particular Minister Trevelyan in particular, for championing the importance of adaptation and resilience. And I also wish to extend gratitude to my very good friend Salim Haq, who is the director of the ICAA, as well as to the government of Bangladesh for hosting this important conference. We're delighted to see the ARA emerge as a consequence of the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit in 2019, when the United Kingdom and Bangladesh played a really instrumental role in advancing our efforts on adaptation and resilience. And I wish you all much success in developing this partnership. You have our continued support, and be our...
Sorry for the abrupt ending there, but that was Selwyn Hart from the United Nations Environment Programme, and we were very happy to hear that he was able to give us that remarks that, you know, how much the ARA is resonating with all of the wonderful work that's being done under the ARA. So I think we can then conclude the high-level segment, and we can then move on to the second section of our program, which is the panel discussion. And the title of that is Bridging Research and Action and the Necessity of an Ambitious ARA. So far you've heard from Salim and our 2 high-level speakers about sort of the context in which we're inserting ourselves, and the challenge on a global level that we're trying to achieve. Bruce and the panelists that he's assembled will be diving into sort of some of the more nuances of that, and sort of really to explain exactly what it is, the niche that the ARA is trying to fill. So I'm going to hand over to Bruce as the panel's moderator, and that's Dr. Bruce Carielda. He's the program leader of the Climate and Adaptation in Africa and Asia at Canada's International Development Research Centre. And he's also one of the steering board members of the ARA. Over to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Suzanne. And let me just start with a bit of a scene setting comment, a perspective from myself, and then introduce the panel.
I'm so sorry, Bruce, but you're quite you're not very loud. Could you try and speak a little louder?
All right, I'll see if I can wake up the neighbors then with my voice.
Okay.
So we've just heard the exciting need for an alliance, the need to come together. We've heard from the minister the call for systemic change. We've just heard the call from the UN for a breakthrough. So something is needed now. But where are we now? What is the need for this Adaptation Research Alliance? And let me just take a step back for the stock taking. Where are we at this moment? We've entered now a decisive decade. We're concerned at the moment, our attention is on a pandemic-affected world. But the climate continues to change, and we know a lot of that is built into the climate system. There is an urgency to act. The goal to stay well below 2 degrees global warming is a global average. Many places will soon surpass that threshold of 1.5 degree warming. That necessitates adaptation now and more in the coming years. This is, in my opinion, an age of implementation. We have to get beyond just coming together every year for climate negotiations or waiting several years for the consensus in the IPCC assessment reports. We have, within a couple of years, the global stocktake that will really be saying how much are we doing in terms of adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action. And we have the continuing challenge now of the wise use of climate finance, whether it's coming from multilateral sources or local governments and what people are investing in their own future. And being resilient by 2030 is not enough. We need to anticipate how people can continue to survive and thrive in the future climates by 2050 and beyond. This is a time frame that's within the imaginations of households and firms. You know, if you're buying a house, if you're setting up a business, the changing climate is now a factor in that. The choices we make now and informed by the science and research can widen or constrain the opportunities we have moving ahead. And as has been underlined throughout this conference, the impacts of climate change are and will be disproportionately experienced by the marginalized and most vulnerable. So how can we ensure effective action at the front lines, as has been referred to? So there's a clear need for greater scale and pace of adaptation research, and one that's more tied to practice and action. Now, at Canada's International Development Research Centre, I've been privileged to be engaged with the support for and work with communities of hundreds of researchers and practitioners across more than 5 continents. We've been identifying and tackling some of the barriers and enablers that catalyze investment. The lessons about the design and focus of partnerships, and the experience of linking research and effective action. So when I heard about the proposal for the Alliance, I immediately identified, yes, this is needed. Indeed, the principles that are sort of put forward of equitable partnership and Southern leadership immediately resonated with me. This is a time for us to be able to share our insights and join forces to create the world we want. Now, coming to this panel, I will be presenting a sort of opening question for each of our panelists. They will be drawing on their experience, and I will be asking each of them to close their opening remarks with identifying a key principle or lesson for this alliance moving forward. The details about each of the panelists will be posted in the chat. If you don't have that open already, I do encourage you to do so. So you'll be able to see the rich CVs experience that they bring to this conversation. And we want to hear from you, our audience today. So using the question and answer feature, feel free to put forward your suggestions. What do you think is a key principle that the Alliance can incorporate? And as time permits, we will be reflecting on those today and taking them up in the steering board and our actions moving forward in the exciting year that we have ahead. So without further ado, let me go to our first intervention. Sheila Patel, founder and director of the Society for the Promotion of Area Resource Centers. In what ways can research better be harnessed to support urban adaptation resilience? Sheila, over to you.
Thank you. I think the idea of this alliance has been very exciting for all of us who are in Shack Dwellers International, which is a social movement of grassroots communities of informal settlements in 33 countries, whose motto in life is when in doubt, count. So we are a ready-made local community-based global network waiting for long-term trusted partnerships with research institutions who are ready to re-engineer their relationship with us so that we don't become objects of their interventions and that we have no control over the policies and the recommendations they make and have to be dealing with things that are thrust upon us because globally they are the cookie cutter solutions that come out of global research. So we believe that adaptation is a seriously local business. It requires people, all kinds of people, to make tough choices about how they live their lives, how they prepare for themselves. And we need simple, powerful, and well-based evidence solutions that come out of this dialogue and discussions. I think that's the thing we want. And as people who have committed to the 10-year journey for local adaptation, we are ready and waiting, not only ourselves, but many other social movements who have been deeply annoyed and feeling deeply exploited by the current format of research. So we embrace this process. We are committed to partner in this process, but we want to be able to define the basis of this partnership. That's our ask. Thank you.
Great. So being able to define the basis of engagement from the local level. Salim Hook, can I ask, you have this wealth of experience having been a champion at development and climate days through your work at ECAD. And as you've mentioned, the LDC University Consortium. Can you tell us about the opportunities for action research to advance the development priorities, such as the range of the SDGs?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bruce. So just picking up on Sheila's comments, Sheila and I, very much champions of locally led adaptation, which in my view needs the co-production of knowledge between the practitioners, the actual vulnerable communities, whether they are slum dwellers in the cities and towns or they are rural farmers and fishers, and the researchers. And in our case, as I mentioned, we have a network of universities in Bangladesh. We have a network of universities across the least developed countries. And all of us are doing research on locally led adaptation, connecting with the vulnerable communities in our countries. So for us, research on adaptation is very normative. It's about doing research and collecting evidence that is going to help the most vulnerable. If it's not going to help the most vulnerable, then in our view, that is of less importance in terms of research. But it has to be good research and action research. And that's why I'm a great fan of ARA and the promotion of action research, which means collaborative research between practitioners and researchers. And the last point I'd make in terms of sort of a direction of travel would be to move into what is, we've been using as a jargon word, transformational adaptation, not just incremental adaptation of risk management and risk reduction, which is obviously needed as well, but transforming out of the current risk situation and coming out the other side a far more resilient society as a whole. And that's really one of the things that Bangladesh as a country is aiming to do. Our Prime Minister has declared a 10-year climate prosperity plan. It's not even resilience anymore, it's prosperity is the objective. That's transformational. That's not just incremental management of risk. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Salim. So I definitely hear you on co-production, the transformational potential of adaptation rather than just incremental, and how this leads to prosperity and resilience in the longer term. Tim Christofferson, head of Nature for Climate branch at UN Environment. Can you tell us in what ways the UN system can help improve the linkages between research institutes and policymakers and communities to foster practical adaptation solutions?
Thank you very much, Bruce. And first, I would like to say that we, my team and I, and also the leadership at the UN Environment Program welcomes this initiative, and like to thank the Center and Bangladesh, the UK countries that have been involved, the organizations that have been involved. We are looking forward to this alliance in particular because we have a large portfolio of adaptation projects. My team has worked in around 50 countries, about $350 million in GCF and GEF projects. We're also soon launching a new global ecosystem-based adaptation facility with small grants for communities. So there's an enormous amount of practical application, but what we lack is a scientific stock-taking of what works best and what are the common ingredients. What is the recipe for success that you can generalize, of course, to a certain degree, and then help adapt those general recipes for success locally? Because as we heard, adaptation has a very localized context, but there are also lessons that we can draw from Bangladesh and Ghana, Gabon, Kenya. There are similarities as well. So we're looking forward to this alliance in particular to help us analyze and distill these key lessons from our portfolio. What the UN system can do is perhaps threefold. One is UNEP has an advocacy mandate. We are the advocate for the environment in the UN system, and as such, we publish every year, as you know, the Adaptation Gap Report, which is the twin of the Emission Gap Report, arguably the most influential report for the annual climate change negotiations. The Adaptation Gap Report recently focused on the role of nature-based solutions, and there again, in particular, I would like to focus more on understanding better the metrics, the key business cases, the multiple benefits that we can measure. All of those are research questions that need answers. We also, as the UN system, of course, have this seemingly never-ending series of conferences, and there's a few of them coming up this year that are quite important. I wish we could all do what we heard from the center, that we keep these all virtual. I think some of them will become virtual, but some of them will also happen in person. We have all the Rio Convention COPs coming up. We have the UN Food Systems Summit coming up. We have the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration on World Environment Day on the 5th of June. So into all these processes, we need to infuse the urgency and the need for adaptation. As the Secretary General, we've already heard, has called for that half of climate finance should be spent on adaptation. At the moment, it's about 5%. So this would be a 10-fold increase in the finance that is directed towards adaptation. And I'd like to end again with this message that in particular, we should look at nature-based solutions here because of their mitigation and adaptation co-benefits and many other multiple benefits if we get them right. So let me stop here and looking forward to the further discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. And I can readily identify with three things that you brought out in your remarks. Having a portfolio of projects rather than letting 1,000 flowers bloom, is there a way of bringing the learning together, delivering as one? What are the additional benefits you can get when you bring diverse activities into dialogue with each other? Partway through, I heard almost like you used the word recipes, but in my mind, it triggered the imagination of several chefs coming together and trading their experience in food preparation. And there's a diversity of diets and dishes we can prepare, but what are the ingredients? What are different techniques for being able to make a good meal? Because we have a world that's hungry for this knowledge and insight. And then finally, the nature-based solutions, which, as you rightly point out, is the theme of this year's Adaptation Gap Report, just released about a week ago, and where nature is part of the solution. It's not just about pouring concrete and gray solutions, if you will. So there's the need for human organization. How do we pursue development, but also how do we do that more in sync with nature? In a moment, I'm going to pull from the comments that we're starting to receive online, but I wanted to first provide each of our panelists, Sheila, Salim, Tim, to respond to each other. What you've just heard from each other in terms of your opening remark and the sort of essence that the Alliance needs to take forward. Sheila, may I start with you? Any response, your reaction to what you've heard from Salim and Tim?
I embrace a lot of those concepts, and all of us who are in social movements are hungry for a serious ongoing dialogue, not just something thrown at us to say, now this is what the world thinks and this is what you should do, without understanding the fact that in today's world, in 2021, we're talking about the burden of poor people facing intergenerational poverty and stuck in survival mode, who have to not only jump out of that, but have to produce a strong anticipated resilience to long-term issues. So that requires a lot of new knowledge. It requires us to adapt, to learn from each other. We already have. All social movements have amazing recipe type of solutions which we learn from each other, like you said. But the thing is that we need a lot of new knowledge. You know, we shouldn't romance just the knowledge that poor people have. They need new knowledge. They need to challenge the knowledge that's coming from elsewhere, and they have to embrace it to produce new adaptation practices. And we need to do that, because those practices aren't going to come out of thin air. They're going to come out of dialogue, discussions, and data analysis, monitoring. All these things have to be done. So one of the things we're looking from the Alliance is also inquiry mechanisms. How do you pose the right question to produce insights into the problems and the potential solutions? Because a lot of thing is to democratize the capacity to inquire and do research. That needs to be universalized. And that's, I think, a very important part of what this Research Alliance has to do. We cannot keep research methodologies and inquiry systems as private business that only gets into PhD thesis and in journal articles that none of us want to read because we go to sleep looking at them. So how do you do that?
I can readily identify, although I don't always fall asleep with some journal articles, but some of them can be a bit dry. Salim, over to you. What you're hearing from Tim and Sheila's provocation, their suggestions of the principles that the Alliance needs to address.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I'm going to pick up on a passing comment that Tim made with respect to all the meetings that are coming up. One of them that he mentioned was the Food Systems Summit, the UN Food Systems Summit that comes up later this year. I have been sort of strong-armed into accepting to be the chair of one of 5 action tracks of the Food Systems Summit, which is on resilience. And the reason why I accepted this, because I'm not a food system person at all, was that it is a very unusual summit in that it's not a negotiated between governments text generating summit. The negotiations are over its SDGs. It's about implementing the SDGs, but it's about systems. It's about connecting the systems. And the mandate that the 5 chairs, who all of us are academics brought in from the outside, is to consult widely, consult with grassroots level groups, consult with the private sector, consult with governments, and there will be a series of national dialogues that take place as well. And then come up with ideas which we are calling game-changing ideas, transformative ideas, not business as usual, because business as usual has been shown not to work. And so that's what we're at the moment doing, and we're doing very wide consultations on this, and we're trying to pull together ideas that we can then take forward. And then our mandate is to agree ourselves with a lot of consultation on what we feel are the major potential game-changing ideas to take forward, and then present them to the Secretary General of the UN, who will then present them to the governments at the summit. After that, we are not the ones doing the summit, we're giving inputs to the summit. And I find that a very interesting modality, and I think that's something that we can think about, a new way of cooking, as it were. The old way of cooking where 200 countries sit and negotiate, you know, for 48 hours without any sleep, that's just not workable anymore. And arguing over commas and words that are meaningless. I mean, that is so old-fashioned and out of date that we should junk it now. Thank you.
I love that phrase, a new way of cooking. Tim, what you're hearing from Sheila and Salim, and reflecting on what are the key principles the Alliance needs?
I would like to pick up where Salim left off with the adoption of the SDGs. There's been a fundamental shift in multilateralism from agreeing what to do to doing what has been agreed. But that shift hasn't really filtered down yet. We're still going through the motions of having new ministerial declarations on this, that, or the other. And that might be still important for some niche topics or new topics that haven't been covered yet. But for climate change, we know what we must do. It is not about negotiating new commitments or targets. It is about doing what must be done. And that also requires a shift in research. It requires a shift towards how do you best, most efficiently, most effectively implement the adaptation commitments in this case that we need. And here it's of course important to note that adaptation is a moving target, because as the world warms further and seemingly at the moment at an accelerating pace, of course, the urgency for adaptation increases, and scenarios for adaptation become more difficult. And often these are very long-term projections that we need. If you talk about infrastructure, but also if you talk about nature-based solutions, what are the right tree species to reforest? For example, in Senegal, where we have a big project, and we looked at all the different science, and there just was not a good science base on this. So we making and programming, in our case, sort of millions of dollars, but globally billions of dollars, and we sometimes lack the scientific basis for making those decisions. So this alliance is very important and timely. And I would also like to encourage the people on this call and also in the audience to think about opportunities like the EU Horizon 2020 call for research projects, because you need big consortia and large networks to access these kinds of funds, but also to have effective research that can give answers to some globally significant questions. So again, in that respect, like to encourage the Alliance to work with us and others to identify what are these key questions, who can we turn to for helping to get them answered in terms of also funding research, and then who can help translate the findings into action, more into action than into policy, because policies are starting to be set in the right way, not at the pace that we like to see, but the actions and the investments we now need to make, we sometimes lack the science that we need.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. And let me just do a quick sort of round of what I've heard from Sheila. You know, the locally led is imperative and very much fitting with the theme of this conference and starting under Gobeshona, and having that serious dialogue with the people at the front line of a changing climate. Salim underpinned co-production, the pulling together of ideas and perspectives. And Tim sparked our imagination on recipes for success, for cooking, for doing what must be done, getting on with the how to do adaptation, understanding that that may change over time. What works now isn't necessarily what's needed in 10 years. What works for Senegal may not be the case for Bangladesh, but the trading of recipes and techniques can be very useful. Tim also touched upon the value of networks and consortia for being able to link the locally led, we heard very strongly, with some of the global agendas, knowledge gaps moving forward. Let me use this as an opportunity to bring in one of the things we're hearing clearly from Roger Street, who's been a participant in a number of the research projects, including the Future Climate Change for Africa. And let me just summarize some of the richness he's brought through in 3 key points. One is to use the phrase translational sciences. And this is perhaps something that's more well known in the health sciences, where again, we have agreement on what the goal is, keep people healthy. And it's about what are the actual techniques and translating the knowledge into really what can help at the bedside in the clinical practice. So the translational science needed to produce relevant and usable knowledge. And this has a long history in sustainability, but something we can build upon as we think about what the Alliance can do. He also encourages us to balance the research that exists. So where we can derive greater usable wisdom, if you will, out of existing research, while we're also pursuing the ongoing research that's needed to address the ongoing gaps. And then to take advantage of existing communities of practice. This is not a tabula rasa where we need to build the organization from the get-go. An alliance, perhaps if I can paraphrase, is about stitching together some of those existing communities of practice rather than starting fresh. Maybe I can give a quick, 30-second response to each of you, what you heard just now from Roger, and maybe you've had a chance to follow his contributions in the Q&A. In this instance, may I go in reverse order? So I'll give Tim the first word, then Salim, then Sheila. Tim, what is your response to what we've just heard from Roger?
Yeah, thank you. There are, of course, multitudes of communities of practice on all kinds of things. Even on adaptation, I can think of several different communities of practice, because if you look at ecosystem-based adaptation, that is different from what we call the gray adaptation, and that is different from the more social aspects of increasing social resilience, but they're all linked. So having a platform, and in our case, what we run is called the Global Adaptation Network, that tries to link these various communities of practice. And then, of course, beyond adaptation, there are many relevant communities of practice. One of the issues, coming back to nature-based solutions, one of the platforms that we are building that will provide an entry point for many different communities of practice is the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which starts this year, and the official launch will be on World Environment Day on the 5th of June this year. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration will have a digital hub that can allow groups like ARA, but also others, to make sure they receive the traffic and interest from policymakers, from potentially also donors, from other researchers who are interested in the work that you do, and then pick that up and basically work on it in this specific community of practice. But whenever we talk about ecosystem restoration, there will be a digital hub under this UN Decade where we will try to then direct the interest to the relevant communities of practice, and at the same time allow them to find each other if you, let's say, want to have a joint green and gray adaptation infrastructure projects, mangrove restoration with seawall building, etc., you need the expertise from different communities of practice, and they need to be able to find each other. So we're hoping that by creating those larger platforms at the UN level, we can also help progress in adaptation. And again, the research that hopefully will maybe not so much be generated, but become visible through ARA will be very important in this respect.
Salim?
Thank you. So let me just cite one specific community of practice with which I've been associated for the last 15 years, which is the International Conference on Community-Based Adaptation, which IID, when I was at IID, started more than 15 years ago and has been going strong ever since. Every year we have a big international conference. This year, we're actually going to be hosting it again virtually here out of Bangladesh, together with BRAC International and ICAD. And we've got thousands of actual grassroots community practitioners. Sheila and Some Dweller Internationals are regular participants. And that is a genuine community of practice on the ground, grassroots communities, urban, rural, farmers, waste pickers, pastoralists. There are huge numbers of them that are practicing adaptation on the ground in the most difficult circumstances. And that really is a community of practice that is just waiting to engage with the ARA if we can find a way to make that happen. Thank you.
Great. And Sheila, but just before I turn over to you, I just want to also recognize that we've got a vote of support from Australia. So the Australian Centre of International Agricultural Research, Veronica Dorr, refers to the importance of supporting dialogues that generate shared knowledge about adaptation, what success looks like, and proposes that the Alliance will need to wrestle with shifting power dynamics as well as shared adaptive learning. So in addition to Roger's point about existing communities of practice, usable knowledge, translation, perhaps you could address Veronica's provocation about power dynamics and adaptive learning. Over to you.
So complicated. Before I do that, let me say what I had begun to do. I think these kind of global institutional arrangements and global institutions have a big duty and obligation to produce local, sustainable relationships between the universities, the communities that are vulnerable, and the local administration. Because we know that it's the combination of these three in long-term relationships that have to both embrace knowledge that comes from different places, that have to actually make things happen, to monitor them. So one of the biggest challenges I feel in all the work that's being discussed globally is that it doesn't make a commitment to reach the small, humble locations where this has to be practiced. And I think that the biggest area of political challenges is how global knowledge interacts with local knowledge. You know, there is such a supremacy of global knowledge right now that everything that comes from below is not treated with the same respect. We talk about it in rhetoric, but this is so even in small universities, in small towns. You know, knowledge and knowledge reproduction in all these areas is of the last century. That has to change. So I think that the Research Alliance's job is not just to deal with research, but to look at the transformative knowledge that these amazing new partnerships will hopefully produce and see that they get embedded in locations. Because local adaptation is not going to happen with global people, either from social movements or from the academia or from the UN flying in and flying out. They have to be embedded in the local things. They have to be able to make those choices. So I think that I would like to put that as a challenge. I want to be part of the alliance, but I also want to challenge the alliance to be able to do that. Because if we work in 5,000 cities, there are 5,000 universities and about 15 to 20% of communities who live informally. How are we going to make them part of this process? That's as important. Otherwise, local adaptation is meaningless if it's going to be thrust upon localities. So for me, the answer to the question from Australia is to transform this into the politics of knowledge, because that's also a deep political challenge today as to whose knowledge is dominant. How is that dominance analyzed? Whose assessment are we going to trust? Because nowadays, most poor people don't trust their politicians. They don't trust global institutions. So there's a trust issue about knowledge as well, which is deeply political.
Definitely hear you. And I'm seeing positive signs that that dominance is shifting. I think we're all getting around that point that you've eloquently said of embedding this knowledge in location. I know it's music to the ears of some of my colleagues who have been supporting embedded researchers to work with local governance in terms of what are the actual challenges on the ground? What are meaningful to people on a day in, day out basis that is somewhat distinct from the global discourse? You've also touched upon your word sustainable relationships and the need to sustain those relationships over time, that it is something that's not a 5 months, 5 years, but this ongoing how we can best support each other moving forward. I just want to recognize that Alexandre has also come in on the chat, expressing how JCI, Climate, and others are sort of supportive of some of these ideas, particularly referring to Tim's reference to Horizon Europe. We also heard from Mark Pelling about urgency, and is there a danger in the focus on urgency, perhaps undermining the absolutely necessary advances in inclusion and equity? We have a crisis in the climate, but we still have a crisis of inclusion and equity in the world. And perhaps, Salim, you're best placed to respond to Mark Pelling's observation that does urgency perhaps create a threat to us being able to address inclusion and equity?
Well, it is, but I don't think we can. I think we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We should be able to do both short and long term at the same time. In fact, if anything, we've been too short term oriented to be really seriously addressing adaptation. So short term has to be taken into account, but we have to have a longer time frame of looking at coming out, as I said, transformational adaptation to me is the way forward, not just incremental adaptation anymore. Thank you.
Great. And just to share with everyone that's online, Anand, who will be taking the floor shortly, has also responded to some of the provocations of production of formal knowledge and being able to link that with what are some of the processes of dissemination, application, and use. And one of the aspirations of an alliance is bring together the breadth of stakeholders, their interests and resources that would actually be able to bridge this across. If we think of a formal traditional research funder, what is the science that needs to be moved forward, and thinking about generation of new knowledge. But we've underpinned here in this discussion the importance of being able to do that translation, the getting additional value and wisdom out of existing knowledge. And that's exactly why we need to have more actors around the table rather than fewer of them. Tim, did you want to come in on anything that you're hearing in the wonderful responses from Salim and Sheila, and the very vibrant now contributions coming in online? Let me just give you a chance for sort of a final word, if you will.
Yeah, I'm glad this issue of trust came up and how it can undermine efforts that are led by institutions. That is a problem for governments, for the UN, for research institutions as well. Where there is consistent high trust, though, is in peer-to-peer networks. And again, that can be positive and negative. People live in echo bubbles, in echo chambers on Twitter and elsewhere, but it does mean that once things spread in that way, the uptake can also be pretty rapid. So in communicating the need and the recipes for adaptation, we need to think about that peer-to-peer transfer of experience and knowledge, that one village in Bangladesh can speak with a number of other villages, and nowadays through the internet that can happen much, much faster than even just 10 years ago. So I'd encourage all of us to look at that as an opportunity as well as a risk. And the same goes for harvesting the kinds of local knowledge that we need to get the recipe right. I remember we had a launch event in Davos for what is called the Trillion Tree Challenge, which was not really prepared by us directly, but there were a number of people involved, and somebody who was very tech savvy talked about the value of drones for planting trees, and luckily somebody in the audience stood up and said, that does not work. It's not drones that plant or grow trees, it is people. And people do that where they live. People have to change the social contract for managing a landscape. That can trigger successful restoration and the regrowth of mangroves. So, you know, we need these kinds of voices from the ground that have the experience that matters, to sometimes also deflate some of the ideas that might sound transformational but just wouldn't work. If you start to fire drones, seedlings into the ground in the Sahel, you know, that wouldn't get very far, because it would just be expensive goat food unless you really change the way that people on the ground see and view and have ownership and stewardship over their land.
Fantastic. I regret I need to draw this panel to a close, but it's very clear that we are hungry. Maybe we need to sit down for a meal. We need to nourish our bodies, but it's also we're hungry for what the Alliance can put forward. This potential for linking research to action. I'm not going to do it justice, but just some of the principles I've heard you bring out today that the Alliance can consider. Locally led, you know, this has to be responding to what are the needs on the ground, on the front lines. The embedding in and informing practice and action. It's not just about more research and pushing forward the frontiers, but really being able to inform the practice on the ground and elsewhere. Equitable partnership, that the ability to move forward on climate action in conjunction with realizing the SDGs, being able to contribute to the aspiration of communities to realize the future that they want. Trust was brought out very strongly, to be able to have trust not only among the members of the Alliance, but also who are our stakeholders, our partners in being able to pursue the action moving forward. And then what we saw again as the sort of analogy, how can we think about this? The recipes people have, the art of cooking that we are bringing together. So I think this is a rich tapestry of ideas for us to be able to think about how do we design and move forward with the Alliance over the next while. Tim, Salim, Sheila, thank you all. And Suzanne, back over to you, I believe.
Well done.
Agreed. That was a fantastic panel. Thanks so much to Bruce for stimulating that fantastic conversation, and all of our panelists for sharing their ideas, and to the audience for the great questions that you're posing to us. I think you'll all be very happy to know that the shopping list of ingredients that Bruce has provided us, many of those I think are in the joint statement that will be shared with you very shortly. And so I'm hoping that you'll all feel that we're on the right track. I am going to start then the last final section of our program, which is entitled Committing Together and the Road Ahead. So I think we've been having quite high level discussions about the need for this alliance and for what this alliance should focus on and what it could achieve. And now it's a bit getting to a bit more of the practicalities of it, about what exactly are we going to be doing and what exactly have we committed to so far. So that will all become a lot clearer in this next session. And we'll start with a short film that sort of gives a bit of a sense of where we've got to so far in terms of our thinking, and sort of sets the scene. And then I'll hand over to the two co-chairs of the Adaptation Research Alliance, and we'll have a presentation from the two of them to really explain to us about what we've achieved so far, share the joint statement that has been signed up to by at this time 32 organizations and hopefully growing every day from here, and then we will have a chance for more questions and answers. So if you have more thoughts or more questions from the panel or from the film and from the following session, you feel free to stick those into the Q&A box, please do. So I'm now going to ask my colleagues at SSN to please cue up the film that we have prepared for you.
The number of climate-related natural disasters is climbing in an alarming rate, with significant economic and health-related impacts, and that is especially for the most vulnerable. So this is why adaptation is needed on a large scale.
Well, we all know that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and we already know, thanks to the scientific community around the world, that we urgently need to transition to low carbon economies and societies and to pursue sustainable development. And we all know also that adaptation is one of those sustainable development solutions, considering the impacts of climate change that we cannot avoid and affects more seriously developing countries that are the most vulnerable. We also know that the Paris Agreement already recognized the parity, the equal footing with mitigation, and the need to increase adaptation capacity, to strengthen resilience, and to reduce vulnerability.
For action research involving people doing adaptation and then learning how to do adaptation is the way that we will generate new knowledge and be able to share that across the world.
So whether it is called action research or it's called participatory research, whatever name it is given, the main ingredient to make it absolutely people-driven is essential in the climate space, in the area of adaptation. Because what that does is that it allows communities to collectively identify their challenges and examine their processes to make either confirmed choices of what they're doing right or to make changes.
Action research helps see alternatives and build new social and new research networks. You know, the actual or the very fact of working with a new set of partners in doing research, with bringing in civil society organizations, NGOs, community members, to really private sector as well as public sector, the government, you know, is such an important part of doing the research. Bringing together these circles under a research mantra or umbrella can really increase the strength of the research findings, because those findings will have been created in partnership. As part of the ARA program, we did the work in Botswana and in Namibia that I would categorize as action research, because it was an effort to bring together a number of sources of knowledge to, at the same level, with no hierarchies, discuss what is making people vulnerable in a particular area of Botswana and of Namibia. For me, the value of this example is that it was so compelling to government that government decided we want to do this in the case of Botswana, not just in this sub-district, but we want to do it nationally, so that they informed national strategies for development. In fact, such exercises ended up having direct inputs, direct impact in the district development plans of various districts in Botswana.
And so what we have done in the city of Gaborone is that we have created a platform in which we have had a core learning initiative where all stakeholders of the city come together to share knowledge and to share information, as well as to co-create solutions to the issues that they are facing of climate change under an umbrella of action research, where we were doing research in order to do both the exploration together as well as come up with solutions.
If we need to scale up research, action research, research that connects to implementation, research that works, gets out of the lab, gets into the field, works with farmers, works with local communities that are struggling to cope with climate risks. If we need to do that, we need to really scale up investment. But beyond investment, we need to actually change the way research is done.
So there is potential for a new architecture of research to be done, in which communities, professional NGOs that work with them, researchers from the north and south develop a new circle of partnerships that begin to address what has not worked from a perspective of developing a new paradigm through which the policy framework can be changed.
So the Adaptation Research Alliance is a very good new initiative trying to link together researchers who are working on adaptation in different countries around the world, as well as practitioners who are actually trying to do adaptation in different parts of the world. And as it happens, the most impacted regions around the world are poor developing countries in Asia and Africa, at least 50 vulnerable developing countries who are at the forefront of tackling climate change as we speak and are going up an experiential learning curve, which is possible for them to share their knowledge both south to south with other developing countries and indeed south to north with the developed countries who will face the problems of climate change in coming years as well.
So we need to be an advocate. The Alliance needs to be an advocate for change in funding, change in the way we do research. Beyond that, the Alliance needs to help in better planning and coordination. Very often we have research projects funded by two different funding agencies that are working on the same problem, that are working with the same communities, but are not talking to each other. They don't even know sometimes that they exist. And that can be addressed through better planning, better information, better coordination. So these are the functions that the Alliance will hope to take up as it gets going. In many ways, the timing for the Alliance is right. We are at a fairly historic moment in time, even as we are grappling with the pandemic and with COVID-19, the climate crisis continues building up, continues unabated. And we are looking this year in particular as a year of signal importance if we have to scale up our efforts to COP26 in Glasgow.
COP26 is a critical moment for galvanizing action on adaptation and resilience. It's also a prime opportunity to underscore the centrality of research for understanding what works and what doesn't, to ensure our communities are resilient to the challenges posed by future climate change. However, current support for adaptation and resilience research is insufficient. It's lacking in coordination, and the research is not effectively linked through to implementation well enough to address the magnitude or urgency of practical actions that are needed to build a climate resilient future. Together, we can change this. The Adaptation Research Alliance is a bold, new, global collaborative effort to build that bridge between research and action. We will work together in the run-up to COP26 to co-develop a strong alliance with ambitious but realistic outcomes that enable adaptation and resilience research led by the needs of the most vulnerable, and which develops solutions that address the scale of the climate emergency.
thanks very much for everyone for your attention, and I hope that you found the video informative about where we're going. To elucidate that in even greater detail, I have the great pleasure of finally introducing you to the co-chairs of the Adaptation Research Alliance. And so first I'll introduce Dr. Rosalind West, who is the Climate Science Lead for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And secondly, we have Professor Anand Patwardhan from the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. And you'll also, those of you who are part of the World Adaptation Science Program will know his face very well as well. So I will hand over to our two co-chairs. They have a presentation for you to elucidate further about what the ARA is up to and its next steps.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you to the Gobeshona Conference for welcoming us today and for enabling us to share our thinking on the Adaptation Research Alliance with you through this event. Over the last year, I've had the pleasure of being involved in a whole series of rich discussions with a wide range of people representing organisations from around the world, from science, from research, from action on adaptation and resilience, who have all seen the need to come together to co-develop an Adaptation Research Alliance. And I've had the pleasure of co-chairing that effort with my esteemed colleague, Professor Anand Patwardhan at the University of Maryland. On behalf of those organisations, it's my honour and privilege to share our declaration today. So if we could just move to the next slide. And we are calling this the Adaptation Research Alliance Gobeshona Declaration on the 23rd of January 2021. We, the representatives of 33 organisations spanning 194 economies, have come together at the Gobeshona Global Conference on Locally-Led Adaptation today to declare our intent to co-develop the Adaptation Research Alliance, a bold new global partnership to catalyse and scale investment in action-orientated research for climate adaptation and resilience. At a time when the need for evidence-based adaptation solutions is growing rapidly, the global research community is not yet sufficiently mobilised and connected to the actors on the front lines, governments, communities, and marginalised people. As a result, research efforts are not adequately meeting worldwide demand for coordinated and actionable evidence to guide effective adaptation and resilience strategies that will reduce the impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable. Without a significantly increased and targeted effort to mobilise research in a transdisciplinary, action-orientated manner that works hand in glove with practitioners on the front lines and grapples with the prevailing socio-political and environmental contexts, the major risks that arise from climate change will not be addressed with the necessary solutions. The Adaptation Research Alliance, or ARA, will, through targeted advocacy, creative cooperation and scaled resource delivery, ensure that the most pressing knowledge needs for adaptation and resilience actions are effectively addressed, and that measurable progress and evidence of the effectiveness of past and ongoing adaptation interventions are at hand. This includes accelerated and scaled investment in developing countries, including the least developed countries and the small island developing states, for action-orientated and user-centred research in ways that build long-term institutional and human capacity and help to transform the research process, ensuring that high-quality research that has wider ownership and greater practical impact. We envision a world by 2030 in which the research community is a highly valued partner to policymakers, practitioners, and the most vulnerable communities, and engages effectively to support the delivery of innovative, user-driven solutions for adaptation and resilience from the global to the local levels. In endorsing this vision, we commit ourselves to meaningful action and mutual accountability for realising the systemic and structural changes needed in adaptation and resilience research. We will work together in the run-up to the 26th session of the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC to co-develop the ARA and ensure that it sets targets for ambitious and realistic outcomes that enable adaptation and resilience research that is led by needs of the most vulnerable and develops solutions commensurate with the scale of the climate emergency. I'm delighted to share the following list of signatories with you. And I would like to thank colleagues at each and every one of these organisations for sharing their expertise and insights in developing the Alliance so far, and would like to invite now many other organisations to join us as we turn this vision into reality. And the next slide. So this year is a very important year. The UK presidency of COP26 has chosen to focus on adaptation and resilience as one of its 5 priority campaigns. This will encourage greater political ambition, coordination of efforts and commitments to build resilience through support to deliver practical adaptation at scale. As I said before, COP26 is a critical moment for action on adaptation and resilience, and that action needs to be underpinned by research and evidence. We, through the ARA, we intend to seize this opportunity of COP26 and use it to underscore that critical role that research really plays in understanding what works and what doesn't to ensure that our communities can be resilient to the effects of climate change. The Adaptation Research Alliance will do this by bringing together research and action communities, by bringing together traditional research funders and action funders, and catalyse increased investment in action-orientated research. It will seek to promote research modalities and activities that are collaborative, that are Southern-led, that strengthen our local universities and the research institutions, and importantly, lead to capacity building to do and to use research, and to link that research to implementation at multiple scales. I'm now going to hand over to my esteemed co-chair, Professor Anand Patwardhan, who'll provide us some more detail of where we've got to with the development of the Alliance so far and the road ahead to COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, and again, thanks to everyone, to Salim in particular, for providing us with this platform and this opportunity. I think there's been really an excellent panel discussion to set the stage and actually highlight the challenges and set up the challenge that the ARA seeks to address. What I will do now is to follow on from Rosalind's remarks and give you a little bit more of a sense of how we see the Alliance taking shape, what some of the functions of the Alliance might be, and how we see the development process in the months ahead from now to a formal launch of the Alliance at the COP. So the mission of the Alliance really stems from the challenges that Sheila, Salim, Tim, and others posed to us in the beginning, which is how do we accelerate and scale investments in action-oriented research in developing countries that is focused on the pressing knowledge needs for adaptation and resilience of the most vulnerable, but does it in a way that at the same time builds capacity at all stages, all through the chain from research to action, that strengthens these linkages between research and implementation and promotes learning on what works and what doesn't. So we see the research enterprise as something being fundamentally reshaped through the interventions that the ARA might carry out. To do that, we see the Alliance as performing 3 key functions. And the 3 key functions are, first and foremost, the Alliance needs to be an advocate, a powerful advocate for change. Because as we have seen, even in the discussion today, there are powerful systemic and institutional barriers that are often coming in the way. It may have to do with the incentive structures of formal science. It may have to do with power dynamics. It may have to do with, as Sheila mentioned, the tendency to think of local communities as objects of study rather than as full participants and co-creators of the knowledge and solutions that they are going to themselves often develop and use. So these are powerful barriers. They need to be overcome, and that means we need to challenge many of the traditional both funders and doers of research. So this advocacy is, of course, a key function of the ARA. The second function we see the ARA performing is really improving communication, cooperation, and collaboration. The landscape is fragmented. We often might have projects happening in countries that in the same country, maybe even the same sector or region, that are not connected with each other. Limited opportunities for peer learning, which has been already flagged as a key component of building trust. And so this whole notion of how can the Alliance support greater cooperation, greater coordination, greater communication to make more effective use of existing resources. And then it's not enough, I think, for the Alliance to advocate and coordinate. It needs to actually walk the talk. It needs to be the vehicle that can actually deliver enhanced resources and investments for the kind of research enterprise, the action research enterprise we want to see emerge. And resource mobilization and delivery, therefore, then becomes a third pillar, a third key function that the Alliance hopes to perform. To meet these functions, what is the form that the Alliance, can we have the previous slide, please? What is the form that the Alliance might take? Well, clearly it will have to be a multi-stakeholder coalition. It will have to increase that profile for action research, and it will have to do it in a way that simultaneously leads to capacity building, learning, and collaboration, whether it is South-South or South-North or triangular. Next, please. But in doing so, we need to make sure that both the development process that we are engaged in for the next several months, and eventually the Alliance itself, adopts a set of principles that will guide the development and guide the work of the Alliance. Inclusivity, openness, and transparency become central. There needs to be a voice for all members of the Alliance, and activities need to be co-developed. The idea of Southern leadership is quite critical, and that in the process, we are empowering Southern researchers and institutions and building that long-term human and institutional capacity. One of the ideas I think that the Alliance needs to embrace fully is perhaps that of overcoming, as was pointed out earlier in the panel discussion, some of the barriers coming due to short-termism and piecemeal approaches. How do we think big and think long-term? Salim outlined a 10-year journey. That's the kind of long-term journey we need to undertake, going beyond the silos of individual projects or time-limited programs. And fundamentally, the Alliance has to be also recognizing that there are structural and systemic issues that need to be addressed, including gender equality and social inclusion, focusing on women and girls, persons with disabilities, indigenous people, and a range of other marginalized groups whose role is quite central in the long-term goal of building resilience. Next, please. How do we see this development process unfold then over the next several months? It will, I think, have a number of different tracks that will link to each other in a coherent and synergistic way. As Rosalind mentioned, the ARA is fully embedded in the UK presidency's goals for COP26 in the Adaptation Resilience campaign, but also through links with other campaigns. For example, the Nature campaign has a strong emphasis on innovation for agriculture and food security. We see that as essentially complementary to what the ARA is doing through the Adaptation and Resilience campaign. That linkage with the UNFCCC and the COP process is important. And for the ARA itself, then, we will adopt a open and inclusive process that has already begun. A number of the organizations that you saw listed in the previous slide who have come together already are already part of the ARA process through the steering board and through the working groups. We have working groups that are looking at aspects related to governance, to resource mobilization, to indeed the basic idea of action research and the principles that the ARA will advocate for. So these working streams and working groups will continue to develop the ARA form and functions. That will be complemented by a range of facilitated dialogues and consultations. Adaptation actions often take place in particular sectors, whether it's agriculture, whether it's food security, it's health, water, infrastructure, and cross-cutting themes like climate services and climate information, improved disaster management. So these facilitated dialogues and consultations will help refine some of the potential action research programs that the Alliance might be able to nucleate for the COP. Underpinning this will be a robust set of bilateral engagements and consultations with key actors. We need to challenge many of the key actors, move them out of their comfort zones. And that can happen, I think, only through a process of intensive dialogue and bilateral engagement. If you wanted to really make the case for action research, I think it has been made, but it's sometimes worth strengthening that. We see the possibility of commissioning analysis and developing high impact output that could support the concept of action research, the logic and the relevance of the ARA, and the benefits that it can provide, the tangible benefits that it can provide to vulnerable communities and people. We see the development process as having a much broader public orientation as well. Through a robust web and social media presence, the ARA website is now live, has just gone up. We hope to keep that channel and build that channel and then use key moments. Tim, in his remarks, already identified a number of key moments through the year. We have the Adaptation Futures Conference coming up. Salim mentioned the Community-Based Adaptation Conference later in this year. So we will try and use these moments as much as we can for really having a two-way engagement, and not just telling people what we're doing, but really trying to engage them and get their feedback into what we should be doing. So this development process is something we are really hoping that you will all be engaged in actively and support. Next slide, please. Could we have the next? Yes. And this kind of is the call to action that we would like to close this short overview of the ARA with. The ARA will not be successful unless we get your active support and involvement, that you co-create this effort with us. It is transformative. If we really have to meet the challenges that have been outlined for us, it will not happen through business as usual. So we look forward to your endorsement of the statement, engaging in the development process. Different stakeholders will have different roles to play in the ARA. There are, as I said, a multi-stakeholder coalition, all the way from national actors and countries to research funders to action organizations, universities, academia. So there are very different roles and very different contributions that different actors can make, but they can all take up some of these principles and try and fold them into how they do their business. And that, I think, will be an important outcome of the advocacy function of the ARA. And then, of course, we are hoping through this development process to generate and develop a portfolio of ambitious long-term funding programs that will help us actually carry out some of these ideas and principles that we are advocating for. So with that, I'd like to conclude this short overview and really looking forward to your questions and active involvement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosalind and Anand. We have a few questions in the chat already, but do encourage others who haven't yet posted a question to feel free to do so. Clarify any of the things that you might be confused about or wanting more information about how the ARA is going to be working. I think we can start with a question that we had from Albert. And that was, is there an intention in the ARA to meaningfully engage with locally embedded knowledge and actors and privilege such forms of knowledge in adaptation action? I think we've touched on this, but if you'd like to expand that a little bit further.
Maybe I can take a quick start and then request Rosalind to add to that. So certainly, I mean, I think so I see this sort of response at two levels. One is in this development process itself, we are trying to make sure that the actors we engage with and who get involved in that development process through the working groups and the steering boards actually can bring in those perspectives, so they are able to shape the functions and the form of the alliance. And then I think going forward, it will be quite critical for the ARA, if it has to be truly successful and transformative, to be able to figure out maybe programs that directly target some of these university community networks. For example, in cities, there have been some attempts to build these networks. So I think the idea that there could be targeted programs that have that emphasize the engagement of communities in the process of solution development and implementation might be a way to go.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, you know, what we've seen through some of the programs that have really shown us the importance and the success and the relevance of action-orientated research have really taken a co-development approach, bringing those user needs to identify what are the burning questions that this research needs to resolve right at, you know, to the beginning of that research process, and forming those questions right from the outset, and then being involved and engaged throughout the research itself. So I think it's about bringing those, you know, user needs for information right up to the very beginning of the research program development and the projects, and then that long-term engagement.
Great, thanks so much, Rosalind and Anand. Those are really good answers. I'm now going to move over to a question from Vusi, which is in support of Sheila's previous comments and the challenge that she represented at the highest level of authority within the Alliance, so as to ensure that it is not a matter of decisions made on our behalf, but rather with us as part of the structure. It's quite a big challenge. I don't know which of you would like to respond first.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly what we're trying to address through the working groups that we've set up. So over this current phase of the development of the Alliance, we've set up 3 working groups. One that's looking at how should such an alliance be fairly, equitably governed in order that it can be most effective, and especially for the most vulnerable people. So I think that that first working group is really the place where this question is being tackled head on. Anand, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
Yeah, maybe just very briefly. I think this is a very important point, and I think one of the ways of doing it is to point out that the form and function of the alliance is by no means settled, and that's precisely why through this development process we want to ensure that we really think hard about how a alliance like this should be organized. There are different functions that we are hoping it will play, and how do we find a governance structure that ensures there is not just representation, but really the ability to set direction. I think to me that's really what is expected, that we have to go beyond simply making issues or constituencies visible. They have to have real authority to be able to direct and influence the direction of movement of what happens.
Thank you. And then I have another question from Farhana, which says, I really appreciated Sheila's brilliant comments as well. Maybe, Sheila, we're going to have to go back to you because this all stemmed from you. We'll have a final reflection after this round of comments. I think more people would benefit from hearing a bit more about how you envision are the best ways that researchers overseas can embed and do ethical research on the ground, so that knowledge isn't only for academia and journals, but valuable and co-produced locally. So I'll let Anand and Rosalind respond first, and then I'll go to Sheila to wrap up this particular round of really good questions. Anand, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. I think, you know, so it's sort of, you know, I sort of keep wearing now my academic hat. And as a professor, I think I can be accused, we can be accused, and I see the merit in that accusation that the research enterprise is often extractive in nature. We go out to the field to study, we come back, we write up the findings of our studies and publish them. And I think that observation definitely has some merit. I think that's the reason why a change in the research enterprise is so critical, because we have to change it at multiple levels. We have to change it in terms of how research problems are defined. What is a good research problem? It is something that requires changes in the incentive structures for academia. You know, what is the incentive structure in terms of rewards and recognition? And I think it also means that we have to change our thinking in terms of that when we are researching, we're not doing it for the objective of getting a high value publication at the end, but we are doing it with the objective that this is actually going to make a difference and make a change. And if that has to happen, it cannot happen without really the people we are working with becoming owners of that process. And this may be hard to achieve, may seem, you know, hard to achieve in practice, but I think that is the reason why some of the things that the Alliance can do by setting research priorities and changing some of these reward incentive structures could help in the sort of new research enterprise we want to see happen.
Thanks, Anand. And Rosalind, would you like to add?
I think Anand said everything that I was thinking of. So I think I'll better to hand over to Sheila, who's the real expert on this.
Great. Sheila, are you happy to come in?
Oh, yes. It's rare that I get so many academics listening to me, so I'm all ready to talk. But I just want to give a very, very important example. There was a bid about 2-3 years ago on public health and public policy, and a UK government research group. You know, there were all these bids, and for the first time, we had a university asking us whether we would be partners and designing the entire proposal with us. This was a health program in 5 countries: Bangladesh, India, Kenya, Sierra Leone, 4 countries. Now, when COVID came in, everything got messed up. But we said, look, we are not going to do any of the traditional plan that we had about looking at public health and public poverty and planning and stuff like that. We have to go deep into understanding how are we going to deal with COVID. And that process became the front runner of addressing the issues of food security, of public health, of general morbidities. We were able to anticipate many of the challenges and the crises that public health policy of the municipalities and the government were still grappling with, while we had already figured out what people wanted. How the public distribution system for food has to change, how people just can't look at COVID morbidities, they have to look at all the other challenges that people are facing, how it's linked to water and sanitation, how the WHO guidelines are not looking at poor people living informally. All these things came out of what we were doing by working on the ground. And because we had people in public health who worked closely with us and trusted us, what we transformed in that process has not only made us sensitive to what people needed and what our cities needed to do during this period, but it has also transformed not only our own way at looking at climate, public health, resilience, democratization of health facilities in cities, a whole range of things. which are going to enhance the outputs that we are doing. And you won't believe it, although we have 3 countries from SDI working on it, this has made SDI take on health as a very integrated aspect of habitat work. So what I'm trying to do is to say that if those partnerships are genuine and that they are going ready to battle on all fronts on convictions that come out of our collective things, then they produce new ways of addressing and managing things that can be institutionalized long after this project is over. So I think it helped all of us get out of project mode and data collection mode into responding to what people needed to do during this period. I don't know if that helps you, but that's the kind of thing I want ARA to do.
Thanks so much, Sheila. And that is fantastic, because I think what we've been talking about within the different working groups and steering boards is really about how do we shift from academics doing something in a bubble and practitioners doing something in a bubble and funders doing something connected to one of those 2 bubbles but not both, and bring it all together. And I think that what, as you said, by that practical experience of what's happening on the ground, that needs to come into research, and what research is doing needs to come into what's happening on the ground. And it's only if you create those synergies that we're really going to be making that big step forward that we're hoping to achieve. I'm going to draw the Q&A. Oh, sorry, Rosin, do you want to?
Suzanne, I just had one last thing to say, which is that, I've come into this from the world of climate modelling, and I think that for too long we focused our efforts of that world in the important task of understanding what the hazards are that climate change presents, and trying to understand the range of impacts and all of that kind of thing, which is a very detailed scientific effort that's gone into that. And yet it still leaves us with the question of what to do about it for communities, especially those on the front line. And I think that the process of action-orientated research enables us to turn that on its head and identify these pressing questions, which are: what are the most pressing needs for knowledge for people to survive and thrive under climate change? And how can we ensure now, through the Adaptation Research Alliance, how can we ensure that the research that gets funded as a priority actually meets those needs? And I think that's what we're really seeking to do with this. I think that's what we're seeking to do. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rosalind. We're drawing to the end of the Q&A. I don't see any further questions. So we're just going to move to sort of the final remarks from our 2 co-chairs, and then I'll give a very brief closing as well. Anand, would you like to kick off your final remarks?
Sure, thanks very much, Suzanne. And I want to first really thank everyone who's been here on this panel. We have had some really good discussions and food for thought, and I hope that we will catalyze them and capture them and use them as we move forward. There's just a couple of observations I wanted to make that really struck me through this conversation. The first, I think, was that to me, what comes out very clearly is the need to build relationships amongst different actors. It's not just about communicating or even translating knowledge from one community to another. I think we need sort of sustained relationships, and building relationships needs time, needs trust, needs commitment. And so I think in some ways, this is a part of the challenge that the ARA confronts, is how do we create even a way by which research programs can help build these long-term relationships at different scales. So at the community level, how do we get a local university engaging with organizations in a meaningful way? At the national level, how do we get, Daniel's example in the film of the government of Botswana changing how they think about adaptation planning is an example of that influence, but now operating at the national level. And indeed, this is really, I think, one of the key goals is how can we get these meaningful relationships that then change the way in which knowledge and research and connect to action. The second point that I've really taken away and has struck me from this conversation is that we need to truly have a advocacy platform that's effective. We need to ensure that we are able to document, learn, and share. And there are lots of knowledge platforms out there. I think we don't need to necessarily duplicate them, but we need to use them to move the agenda forward. And then finally, I think, you know, as Minister Trevelyan said in her opening statement, we have to be bold. I think this is one of the opportunities and challenges we face. But I think being bold and transformational is not just the way to go, it's just the way it has to be if we have to be successful. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anand. And now I'll hand over to Rosalind for your final remarks.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thank you, Anand. And I'd like to say some thank yous now. I'd like to thank first Professor Salim-ul-Huq for his support for the Alliance and his great insights and advice in developing it so far, and for his invitation to us to use this opportunity of the Gobeshona Global Conference to hold this soft launch event. And I think it's been such an ideal platform for us to do that. So thank you also to the organising committee for welcoming us. I'd also like to thank the steering board and the working groups that we've set up for the Adaptation Research Alliance, and very importantly for the coordination group for their considerable efforts in getting us to this point. I'd like to thank those who've arranged the high-level video messages. I'd like to express particular thanks to our distinguished panelists and our moderator for your wisdom, for your provocative thoughts, and your great responses to the questions that have been posed by the audience. And most of all, of course, I'd like to thank the audience themselves for joining us and for giving up your Saturday to join this session. And I suppose I end with an invitation to you all. And that's that an alliance is only as strong as its members and the common mission that binds them. And it's clear that there's increasingly urgent need for figuring out how to adapt and build resilience across scales, across sectors and geographies. And I know that there are many other organisations, networks, communities, people who share this mission. Please join us. I believe that this Adaptation Research Alliance can be a very powerful connector of our rich but fragmented system. So let us come together to build and to share our knowledge, to develop our understanding, and to harness the power of research to develop actionable solutions and turn our collective ambition into evidence-based action. Thanks all very much.
Thanks so much, Rosalind. And just to echo that, I'm going to suggest that you look at the chat box just to see how you can connect with us. So there's a website link. There are LinkedIn and Twitter handles in there. There's also, I can ask my colleagues to put in the email address for if you want to find out more about joining the ARA or joining a working group. Please encourage you all to reach out to us, engage with us. We are looking forward to hearing from you. I will then just take this last opportunity to say a big thank you to both the co-chairs for sharing the way forward for the ARA. And I'm hoping that, through this conversation today, we've inspired a few more organizations to consider becoming signatories. We've encouraged a few more individuals to think about joining our working groups, or at least adopting some of the thinking that we are advocating for, the principles of action research. And I think the last thing then, just to reiterate Rosalind's point, that it is a Saturday, and we're very, very grateful to all of the participants for attending and giving up their afternoons. We look forward to working with all interested parties to make the ARA a huge success in 2021. And we'll hopefully be hearing lots more from us and lots more from you. And with that, I will draw the session to a close.